Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here as always with Dr. Tyler McNabb. And we have a special episode today. There is a new book coming out soon, February 11th, T&T Clark's Handbook of Analytic Theology. And I know if you've been online in the Twitter and Facebook, philosophy, religion, and theology, analytic theology groups, you've seen a lot of talk about this book. So we're really excited to have both editors of the book on the show today to sort of talk us through analytic theology as well as the new book that's coming out. And so we have my Paisan brother, James Arcadi, and JT Turner, both analytic theologians, again, editors of the book, and they were nice enough to give us some time today. So guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. How are we doing today?
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Really excited about this new book. Before we get into the table of contents, sort of maybe talk us through the book itself, JT, or no, let's start with James. James, maybe you could define analytic theology for us. What is analytic theology?
Good question, and you'll find that analytic theology means maybe different things to different people at different times and in different contexts as well. So I think Dr. Turner kind of agrees. I mean, we take a kind of a little more of a deflationary account of what analytic theology is. I like to think of analytic theology as simply as doing theology, but utilizing the tools, sensibilities, resources of contemporary analytic philosophy. And oftentimes the border line or the border region between analytic philosophy of religion or analytic philosophical theology and systematic theology in the analytic mode is a very kind of like vague or porous kind of border. And I think that's kind of fine. So anytime you're sort of like doing theology, saying things about God in relation to everything and everything in relation to God, but doing so with an eye towards some of those sensibilities that the analytic philosopher has tended to have, then I think you could be counted as doing something like analytic theology.
Hey guys, thanks for coming on. I have a quick question for you just to follow up on that. You kind of mentioned it briefly, but if someone said, no, I'm not doing analytic theology, I'm doing analytic philosophical theology, would you understand them to these sorts of fields to be the same sort of field, or are there demarcations that we should be aware of?
I think a fair way to think about analytic theology. So I just got finished reading for, I don't know, the third time, Oliver Crisp's new Analyzing Doctrine book. And he makes the argument that analytic theology can be done as systematic theology, but it doesn't have to be. And I think James and I both would agree that analytic theology is more like a genus under which you might have different species. And so systematic theology might be one, analytic philosophical theology might be the other, however you want to parse that out. So, I mean, I think I would just want to get clear on what the person meant when they said they weren't doing analytic theology, and then try and, show them that maybe analytic theology can count as an umbrella term of sorts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Well, what would be the best objection that you've heard toward doing analytic theology? So I've been around some people that they haven't liked the idea of analytic theology too much. They generally are biblical studies guys who the theology that they do have or that they have read up on is more the continental stripe. And so whenever I bring up analytic theology, they're not big fans. So what are some of the best objections that y'all have become aware of over the years, and how would you respond to the objection? So maybe start with you, JT, and then go to James.
What are the best objections?
Are there any good objections?
That's honestly, that's seriously, that sounds super snarky and a bit arrogant, but honestly, I think it's right. And here's why I say that. Most, barring a few exceptions, most of the complainers are this. It's not even really identifiable who the complainers are. It's sort of nebulous. It's kind of like out there that this is a complaint or that's a complaint, but nobody's really writing papers or books attacking the methodology. So I really don't know what the arguments are supposed to be. I hear rumors that it's analytic theology doesn't allow mystery, or analytic theology is ahistorical, or analytic theology doesn't allow use of metaphor, or whatever the case may be. And of course, all those things are just false. At least if you think analytic theology is an umbrella term that covers a lot of what different thinkers are doing. If you read Oliver Crisp, you know history, metaphor, mystery are all available. If you read Tim Paul, you know that rigorous analytic, like logic chopping metaphysics is part of it, but also a deep adherence to the Catholic councils and dogmatic pronouncements and so on. Like Tim Paul knows more about the Council of Chalcedon than probably almost any other systematic theologian that's out there. Like the guy knows all the stuff that was happening in the backroom channels, all the documents that I don't read, he's read and has memorized. So the bit that this is ahistorical, that it doesn't land. So I don't know what the best objection is supposed to be.
It would be pretty awkward, right, to say that there's no room for mystery after you've read, say, James Anderson's Christian Theology and Paradox volume. That would be
which is all about that. Yeah. And James happens to be one of our contributors. So yeah, exactly. Yeah, James, go for it.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I mean, I think there's an objection in the neighborhood that sometimes one hears from biblical studies scholars that I think doesn't hit analytic theology specifically, but kind of hits all systematic theology. So there is at sometimes within some quarters of biblical scholarship a bit of an eye that all you really need to do is work with the biblical text. And once you're done with that, like you're done doing theology. Yeah. And so anything that kind of moves beyond that, whether you're a Bardian or a Tillichian or an analytic or what have you, is kind of like outside the bounds of what one ought to be doing. Maybe a related kind of objection that one sometimes hears in that quarter that perhaps you're talking about, Tyler, does come from those in more the kind of Bardian or Websterian, John Webster's sort of like line of thinking. And maybe this would even be like the early John Webster, which takes theology to be something more of an act of proclamation as opposed to an act of argumentation, wherein the theologian, again, in the Bardian but early Websterian sense, sort of merely like declares what it is that is the truth about God, or what is the truth about an interpretation of scripture or what have you, without actually trying to argue for or contend for the truth of those claims. And I think that's one stylistic difference you see with a lot of analytic theologians, is analytic theologians try to make arguments and they try to support their observations with evidence, with data from scripture, from the tradition, from reasoning, or what have you. And it's not all just like natural theology, like one has to just construct arguments out of purely empirical premises or what have you. So using scripture and the tradition and whatnot is I think totally cool for the analytic theologian. But it's more of a sense of like, I'm trying to contend for a particular angle on this theological claim that I'm making, which again is a bit stylistically different than one sees in some kind of other quarters of contemporary systematic theology.
And guys, we didn't talk about this beforehand, so I can cut it, but I am curious if you guys, just coming at this as Christians, what are something that, you think about this objection, what is something you can point to that analytic theology has really either clarified or brought to the table when it comes to our Christian faith, really added to the discussion? I know, I think of Tim Paul's work in the Incarnation and stuff like that. Is there one or two things that you guys can say, oh yeah, this was a major addition to our faith and to Christian theology that came from analytic theology? Maybe we start with you, James.
Sure. I think perhaps two lines of benefit. One could be an apologetic benefit. So there's a sense in which analytic theology has been utilized in order to make rational defenses of the Christian faith to the, to the non-Christian or to the secular opponent or the atheist or what have you. But that's a kind of analytic theology that I've not tended to do. I've tended to do more sort of like the constructive, systematic, theological sort of side of things, wherein, my kind of MO or kind of the angle that I take is, as I like to tell my students, it's sort of like the man who says to Jesus, "Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief." And this is kind of a faith-seeking understanding project in an Anselmian sense. And so we have all these doctrines and ideas and data from Scripture and the tradition, but a lot of it's kind of fuzzy, and a lot of it might going to be hard to see how it fits together. I think one of Analytic Theology's gifts, perhaps, or vocations to the theological community is trying to get in there and make some sense of some things, clarify some things in order that we can deepen our understanding and thereby deepen our faith.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. JT, did you have anything to add to that, or we can move on?
Yeah. So, right. I mean, in my own experience, it kind of tracks along with what James was just saying. A lot of the benefit has to do with constructive accounts of Christian doctrine. So I can just speak to my own sort of context here. I teach at a Christian university with, liberal arts undergraduate students primarily. I teach a few graduate students, but not that many. And in our College of Christian Studies, we've got a lot of hopeful ministers of the gospel, and many of them are hungry to learn about how things work. Like, okay, we believe the doctrine of the Trinity, we believe in the incarnation, we believe in the bodily resurrection, we believe in the hope of the new creation, we might even believe in, some kind of eschatological deification, or some model of the atonement, maybe penal substitutionary atonement or whatever. And their questions, just as growing undergrads who have left the cozy confines of their local church, is how does this work? Like, how do we, what's the mechanism involved in the atonement? How is it possible for the body that dies to rise again? How is it possible for the divine Son of God to become a human being? It's not that they're questioning whether it is possible, they just want to know how. And here, Analytic Theology, I can point them to a bunch of resources and say, look, I'll just tell you up front, do we know exactly how it works? No, but here's some resources you can have to help you think more clearly about the doctrine itself. And I don't know, when I see the light bulbs in my students, like you can just see it light up in their eyes, go, oh my gosh, this thing that I've wanted for a long time actually exists. And when you tell them, like, the research is open for their own inquiry, they can expand on it, they get even more excited. And that gives them, it gives them another thing they can chew on, another thing they can pursue besides just, here, I'm going to train to learn how to preach the Bible, which is great. But they also want to be able to talk to congregations and youth that they might be over on how it all works.
Yeah, that's good. Can y'all walk us through y'all's book? I don't know, maybe if y'all had it in mind, some sort of survey, if you had like a 5-minute spiel or something like that, a 5 to 10 minute spiel regarding the contents of the book, maybe the sections or something like that, just kind of a brief overview of, in case someone's listening and says, you know what, I have an extra $175. I just really want to spend it. Oh, here's a great way to spend it, on the volume. What would be the commercial that y'all could give us?
But maybe I could say something kind of like about the overview, and perhaps JT wants to come in on some of the finer contours. So I think when we were talking about putting this text together, we wanted to put a book together that was going to be helpful for students, for scholars, for even pastors who were looking into standard doctrines, standard topics within Christian theology. But we wanted to be able to offer them something from the analytic tradition. So I always kind of had in mind, I teach seminarians, masters of divinity students, ministers, future ministers and the like. I always kind of had in mind, like, one of my first year MDiv students who was writing a paper on the Trinity and thought, I wonder what the analytics had to say about the Trinity. Or they're writing a paper on the Eucharist. That's my area of expertise. And so I wonder what the analytics have had to say about the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Okay, here's a resource where you can go to that chapter. They're relatively brief. I think they're in the 4,000 to 6,000 word range or so. You can kind of get an overview of what has gone on in analytic theology over the last few decades on the particular topic, and then typically get the author's constructive perspective on that particular topic. So in that fashion, we've arranged the book sort of along the lines that one might see in standard reference works in systematic theology, whether those are standalone systematic theologies by single authors, or other kinds of similar books in the neighborhood, the Oxford handbooks and Cambridge companions and that sort of a thing. So it's sort of got a familiar doctrinal shape to it.
And might I add that I think the list of contributors and topics is so thorough, and the list of contributors, so many all-stars, so to speak, for our discipline. I think y'all really put something together, extremely special. It seems like a really special volume. So,
thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, JT, do you want to expand on what James was saying?
No, I mean, James covered it pretty well. I think so I'm going to add one thing, but that's maybe because I forgot if James said it or not, that it's, it is, as he rightly said, a place we hope that people will come to as a beginning to research. And that's what we think of it as, like, here's like an introductory volume on all these topics, as you just mentioned. Like, it's got a lot, and just says, you just say, here's where some analytic theologians are staking out a position. Each chapter attempts to demonstrate how to do analytic theology on the relevant topic, but then it says, look, there are these people to consult, these further things to consider, go and do likewise. And we've attached an expanded bibliography to the end of the handbook that allows for even further research. So it's really like a first step for someone's research in any given theological, well, I don't want to say any given theological topic, but most of the theological topics of which we're aware from an analytic perspective.
That's a great reminder, JT. I mean, I think that was one fear we had. We didn't want to see this as like the definitive, like, here's what AT says about this topic and we're done. Like, these are all starting points.
Right.
This is where you might start to get into the conversation, but then, yeah, as JT says, then go and do likewise. Write your term paper, or write that journal article, or maybe you're not in analytic theology. You are a Bardian or a Websterian or what have you, but you want to kind of get in touch with what's been going on in this segment of the theological conversation. Here's hopefully an easy resource to dip into to get familiar with that as you go on and do your work in other areas.
Yeah, and I want to say just a shout out, Tyler, to for our publisher, TNT Clark. Like, they had a word count, and we went over it pretty well, because they honestly they let us get our wish list for topics. They were quite flexible on the amount of stuff that we wanted to cover, and honestly, all the contributors did pretty well keeping it within the relative word limit that we set for everybody. But some topics just take a little bit longer to flesh out, and I don't think we had to cut any chapters or trim any chapters down, not in any huge extensive sense. So it came out, I mean, honestly, better than I could have hoped. Like, I'm so excited about it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to receiving a copy soon. I think it's going to be a resource. I think it's going to be a resource that a lot of people use for years to come. The sections, could you all give me just sort of a brief overview of how you've broken up the volume?
I'm happy to do so. So we've got a few parts with chapters included in them. So the first part is what we might call kind of methods and sources. In systematic theology, it's sort of the prolegomena section here. How do you do theology? Oliver Crisp writing here on model building in analytic theology, which is kind of a certain way in which analytics sometimes go about doing theology. Tyler Ure and Eric Baldwin's essay on epistemology, kind of a important starting place in thinking about theology.
Which we did not go over the word count, just to clarify.
No, you guys are both very quick and very efficient in word use. Both in kind of, yeah.
Thank you.
Model contributors, I would think. And
thanks.
Luke Stamps' essay on the tradition in analytic theology, Benedict Gokey's essay on the relationship between theology and science, but like science in terms of like a body of knowledge, not just the empirical sciences. We have an essay on that later on, and what have you. Dan Howard-Seiner and Dan McKenna on faith. And so kind of like, these sort of introductory topics. And then we kind of move more into the constructive portion. So a whole section on what we might call doctrine of God or theology proper, which treats issues like classical theism with R.T. Mullins, divine omnipotence with Kate Rogers. One of my favorite essays, Catherine Rogers' essay on omnipotence there from the Anselmian perspective. She's a fantastic scholar, and I've loved her work for a long time. But this great essay where she's like, doing translations of Anselm from like the original manuscripts, and then also doing like, I don't know, modal logic and that sort of thing. So
yeah, it's so
just,
hardcore. Love it.
yeah, really, really excellent. Yeah, omnipotence, omnipresence, providence in there as well with David Ferguson, Trinity, those sorts of things related to the doctrine of God. Section on the person and work of Christ, issues having to do with the incarnation. This is where Tim Paul writes his essay, Christ's impeccability with Johannes Grossel, election, atonement. It's William Lane Craig's essay on the atonement, distilling some of that kind of recent work he's been publishing elsewhere. We have a whole section on pneumatology, which maybe is a little bit new, trying to explore an area that's been a bit underdeveloped perhaps in analytic theology. And I think we try to do that at times. What are the standard topics? What are the standard topics? What are some of those topics that might not be standard in analytic theology, or in systematic theology, but are kind of big conversations in analytic theology? I'm thinking of Lindsay Cleveland's essay on God and abstract objects. Not a conversation you have too much in systematic theology, but analytic philosophy of religion, that's been a big debate recently. So I think that's, so we have an essay on that. And then also some of these explored topics, like in pneumatology, or like Faith Paul's essay on animals and sin. That's I think really provocative essay. Not a whole lot written on that. Samir Yadav on analytic theology and race. Again, kind of an underexplored topic within analytic theology, but perhaps representative of our desire to get conversations starting and be a stepping stone towards further things. Some of those are in the kind of creation and humans section. And then we wrap up with a section on experiences and practices. So what are some of the ways in which our theology is expressed? Essays on baptism, the Lord's Supper, liturgy with Joshua Cockayne at St. Andrews, prayer, Scott Davison. So a few of these ways in which theology ends up being impactful for the Christian life, or at least as theologians have reflected on some of these things. That's a bit of an overview of the shape, I suppose, with some of the key essays maybe in those sections, or just essays that are, fresh in my mind.
Well, thanks for that. Mike, did you have any more questions for?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I'm looking at the table of contents now, and you said the names, James, of all the contributors, but wow, I mean, it's incredible what you guys have been able to put together. Maybe just one last thing before we go. You each have a chapter in the book. Maybe you could just give us a quick sort of overview of what your contribution to the book is. So JT, maybe we start with you. Your chapter, The End of Things, Resurrection and the New Creation.
Right. So if anybody's been following any of my recent work, it's gonna be like, oh my gosh, he's on this thing again. Anyway, so I deal with usually what might be described as personal eschatology. So what happens to humans after they die, and in particular thinking about the bodily resurrection. Because I think the bodily resurrection is really just one small part of the Christian eschatological hope. Namely, I think that, I follow the sort of recent biblical studies lines that think that what the Christian scriptures are teaching is that God purposes to make the entire creation his home, his temple. And if that's the end, or telos, hence the end of things, the telos of things, then what I think Christians should be doing is thinking, sort of reverse engineering what's going on. All right, if that's the end of things, what's the purpose for humans now? What does it mean to be an image bearer? Why the bodily resurrection, that sort of thing. And so that essay is just an overview of some of the recent attempts to think through how that might work, some of the difficulties that pop up when thinking about that sort of thing. And some of it is hello, systematic theologians and analytic theologians. We need to take very careful attention to some recent biblical research. Like, we can't just throw it out and rest on old sort of, afterlife conceptions that we might have used in 30, 40 years past, because the Biblical Studies Guild has moved on to thinking about how what the scriptures are teaching. And so I want to sort of alert my colleagues that this sort of thing is going on. So that's what that essay is. What that essay is doing. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. James, maybe take us through. Hold on, let me get it up here. On the intelligibility of the Eucharist doctrines and analytic theology.
Yeah, so it's sort of ripping that title off of an essay that Michael Dummett wrote a number of years ago in a festrit for Basil Mitchell. And that was the title, I think, of his essay, like on the intelligibility of Eucharistic doctrine, which ended up just being his sort of reformulation of a particular angle on a Roman Catholic view of the Eucharist. And part of my interest in that chapter was to show that there's actually quite a lot of diversity within Eucharistic theology, not just in the grand tradition of the church, which of course there is, but even within recent kind of contemporary analytic approaches. Focusing in mostly on Christ's presence in the Eucharist. That's been kind of the main issue. I mean, there's lots of things going on in the Eucharist having to do with sacrifice and memorials and linguistics and what have you, but kind of the metaphysics of Christ's presence has been that issue that's mostly been animating contemporary analytic theologians. So that's what I focused on, and that's what I published on as well before. So in that essay, I kind of do that survey sort of a thing and say, well, here's, who have been defending the Roman Catholic view. Here's some that have been articulating a quasi-Lutheran view. Here's where you might put, kind of a high Reformed theology and kind of on this more of a spectrum sort of a thing. And I just sort of portray those as clearly as I can, and then come to commending one particular view, which just happens to be my view, that I've published on elsewhere. So I guess that's the benefit of writing an essay on something, is you can, come to the climax, and it's like, oh, it's my own view that solves all the problems. And that's what I tried to sneakily do in this particular essay.
Well, thanks, guys. Excellent. I can't wait, like I said, just to go through all the chapters. Y'all put together a really wonderful work. And thank you very much for coming on. And we hope to have you back sometime in the future.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Sounds great.
guys.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.